can share the night. It goes on and on and on and on. Strangers.
What's going on, YouTube? This is Venomous Media back with another video. 2010 was an interesting year for film. There were quite a few acclaimed movies that year, but I also think there were a lot of movies that didn't really get enough love back then. That was the year we did get one of the best animated comic movies of all time, Batman Under the Red Hood. We also got 7 comic book movies on the big screen that year. 2 of them from Marvel, and 3 were DC movies, which might sound exciting at first, but out of the 7, only 3 of them were hits. But there was one that managed to get praise and gain a fan base that's still going strong to this day. Out of the hits, first came Kickass, which was based on the comic by Mark Millar. Kickass got praise for its violent and comedic tone, and it should be noted that Kickass was not in the MCU and was acquired by Image Comics in 2014. Next was Iron Man 2, which was a hit like the first movie, but it got mixed reception from fans, although I personally enjoyed it. Then there was Red, based on a 3-part Wildstorm comic by Warren Ellis, which was DC's hit that year. Now I'll talk about the bombs. First, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Like I mentioned, despite it bombing, the movie was praised. In my opinion, Scott Pilgrim was a victim of bad timing. It seemed like moviegoers weren't ready for a live-action love letter to anime. But thankfully, the fanbase is still going strong to this date. Next, DC's cowboy superhero Jonah Hex made his big screen debut that year, to a less than stellar box office as well as reviews. Then there was Dylan Dog, based on the Italian comic of the same name, which not only bombed but was panned. And DC's last movie that year is actually the subject of today's video. I'm talking about The Losers. And before I get started, I want to give a brief history of the comics. The original Losers series debuted in DC Comics GI Combat issue 138 in a mega-sized comic which included other stories, and it was created by Robert Tyner, who you might know for creating Sergeant Rock, the Barry Allen version of The Flash, Poison Ivy, and Black Canary. The original Losers followed a group of soldiers that were anti-heroes, so think like the movie Dirty Dozen, or a 60s version of the A-Team. Unfortunately, there wasn't much depth to that version, and a lot of it felt pretty random. Then in 1970, the Losers got revamped in another mega-sized comic called Our Fighting Forces, debuting in issue 123, where there was more action and violence. Then finally in 2003, the Losers got a mature and more modern revamp in DC's Vertigo line, created by Andy Diggle and Mark Jock Simpson, both of whom have long resumes within the comic industry. Now, this version of the Losers follows a special forces team led by Colonel Franklin Clay, his second in command, William Roque. Then there's the techie, Jake Jensen. Next is the sniper, Carlos Cougar Alvarez. And finally there's Linewood Pooch Porteous, the pilot of the team. In the comics, they are seeking revenge against a rogue CIA operative named Max, who sent them on a mission in the Middle East, only to try and kill them once the mission was done. Then later they joined forces with a Middle Eastern assassin named Aisha, who has her own vendetta against Max. The series ran for 32 issues, starting in 2003 and ending in 2006. The comics were met with praise and even nominated for some Eisner Awards. After the series ended, it wasn't long before a live-action movie was announced. Overall, the movie got a mixed reception from people, many saying it wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. However, when I saw it for the first time, I really enjoyed it. In my opinion, it got better with each rewatch. I did read the comics later on, and while the movie's a bit different, I still enjoyed it. Even to this day, I think it's a very underrated comic movie and doesn't get enough love. Anyway, let's dive into this. In 2007, it was announced that Tim Story, who directed the Fantastic Four movies, would be the director of the Losers movie. He took this project because he's a fan of war movies, and actually envisioned his take on this to be part Black Hawk Down and part Band of Brothers. Honestly, judging by this, he probably would have been a fit for the first 2 editions of Losers before the Vertigo revamp. However, Story was replaced by French director Sylvain White, whose resume included the direct-to-video sequel I Will Always Know What You Did Last Summer. So at first glance, this might be insane for WB to hire a director who has nothing but low-budget movies to his names, including a panned third entry in a popular 90s slasher series. But he did have a hit movie to his name before helming the Losers. which was Stomp the Yard. Although that part may be puzzling, picking a director for an edgy A-Team or G.I. Joe-like movie who made something that's the complete opposite of The Losers. However, White did say that he was a comic fan growing up and preferred comic books that were more in reality rather than conventional superhero stories. And that's why he liked The Losers. After hearing that, White doesn't sound like a bad choice anymore. Now on to the writers, which included Peter Berg, whose writing, directing, and producing credits included The Rundown, Friday Night Lights, both the movie and TV series, The Kingdom, and Hancock. He was initially going to produce the movie in addition to writing, but after writing the script, he left to direct Hancock. And the second writer was James Vanderbilt, and his writing and producing credits also included The Rundown, as well as Zodiac. Now onto the cast, which actually consisted of some of the biggest actors today, who at this time were still establishing themselves as household names in both film and television. Jeffrey Dean Morgan played Clay, beating out Jeremy Renner, who passed on the role due to scheduling conflicts. The previous year, Morgan played the comedian in Zack Snyder's Watchmen. And also that year, he had a cameo in Jonah Hex. Also in the cast was Idris Elba as Roke, Chris Evans as Jensen, who had previously played Johnny Storm in the Fantastic Four movies, Zoe Saldana as Aisha, who was coming off Star Trek and Avatar, Columbus Short as Pooch, who was reunited with director Sylvain White after starring in Stomp the Yard, Spanish actor Oscar Haneda as Cougar, making his American film debut, Holt McCallany as Wade, and rounding up the cast is Jason Patric as Max. And I'll get into the source material later on, but first I want to talk about the premise. The movie starts off with a Special Forces team led by Colonel Franklin Clay, and the rest of his team includes Roke, Jensen, Cougar, and Pooch, all sent on a mission in Bolivia to take out a drug kingpin named Vertigo. However, things get complicated when they track Vertigo down, as they find there are several kids being held captive by him. The team tries to inform their superior, CIA operative Max, of the situation, but he tells them to carry on the mission as planned, even if there are kids. So Clay and his team decide to ignore Max and go to rescue the kids. However, one of the kids is being held captive by Vertigo, but Clay manages to save the kid and kill Vertigo. However, before dying, Vertigo tells Clay he knows about Max. Clay then reunites with the team and the rest of the kids, and they manage to avoid a missile that destroys Vertigo's empire. Then a rescue chopper comes for Clay and his team, but tells them they can't bring the kids. So Clay tells the rescue team to take the kids instead, and as the chopper is leaving, it's shot down under the orders of Max, thinking it was Clay and his team. After this tragedy, Clay and his team fake their deaths and settle down in Bolivia, with Clay still trying to find leads about Max. And soon Clay meets a mysterious woman named Aisha, who tells him she can help find the Max and clear their names of the tragedy, while having her own reasons for wanting to take down Max. Clay and his team agree to join forces with Aisha, and none of them know that Max is planning on having a snook with the power of a warhead being made for him to use, which is another obstacle they'll have to face in their journey. So yeah, that was the premise. Now I'll talk about the source material. In the comics, there are 32 books divided into 5 arcs, and the movie isn't really based on a specific arc, and honestly just takes bits and pieces from all of them. I do think the movie is fairly faithful in some areas, like the origin of the team, and there are actually scenes in the movie that are straight out of the comics, or almost identical to them, with some tweaks. Like Jensen's dancing scene, and him pretending to be a human weapon from the comics, is in this movie, and Wade getting killed in the plane was from the comics too. While there's a decent amount of source material used, there are actually a lot of liberties taken. The start of the movie is based on the arc, The Past, which explores the assignment that Max assigns the losers, which takes place in Pakistan instead of Bolivia, like the movie. But everything does play out the same. Also, Aisha and her father, Vertigo, are actually Pakistani and not Bolivian. But everything else about them, for the most part, does play out the same in the comics. When Aisha meets the losers in the comics, it's less dramatic, and they seem to already know about her, rather than her mysteriously showing up in Bolivia and fighting Clay, and then joining forces with the losers. In the movie, Roke doesn't betray his team until we are almost at the final act. But in the comics, he's already betrayed them by issue 3, and it's more darker because he actually shoots Clay rather than being captured by Max's men. However, just like the comics, Clay is convinced Aisha sets them up before Roke is revealed to be a traitor. Near the end of the movie, Roke dies in a plane explosion, while he actually makes it out alive in the comics and later shows up in the arc London Calling, and isn't killed off until issue 28 by a machine that Jensen programmed. And unlike the movie where the team makes it out alive, the only survivors in the comics are Jensen and Pooch. Also, Max is quite different too, because in the movie, he seems to have forgotten about the losers, actually saying to Wade that he killed a lot of people, so the losers must have slipped his mind. While in the comics, Clay and Max meet face to face when he gets their assignment. Also in the comics, Max is public with his warheads and is getting media attention. In the comics, Max is believed to have been committing acts of terrorism since World War II, but in the movie that info is never touched upon. And one more thing is, unlike the movie where Max survives and is on the run from the losers, in the final comic, he's killed with one of his own warheads. And there are a couple of notable supporting characters missing, including two agents named Sanderson and Segler, who work with Max, and an ally to the losers named Al-Walid. I think I covered enough of the source material. Now, this would be the part where I normally talk about the costumes, and if the casting looks spot on, but I don't know if I can really do this with the losers. I mean, I guess Clay wears black dress shirt like he does in the comics, and Roke does have scars on his face. But other than that, the characters don't really have iconic looks for me to really critique. I mean, Chris Evans, Columbus Short, Oscar Hanetta, and Jeffrey Dean Morgan are the only ones that really look like their characters, which honestly isn't a real deal breaker for me, because these characters aren't up there with Batman, Superman, or Spider-Man who have iconic costumes. So I'm not really worried about them looking straight out of the comics. Now I will talk about the action, which is kind of a gripe for me. I mean, it's fine, but it's nowhere near the comics where it's basically action-packed and R-rated violence from start to finish. But this movie was given a PG-13 rating, so the gore and violence from the comics is unfortunately absent. What we get is still fine. Another gripe I have as far as the comics go, unfortunately the characters aren't really fleshed out enough in the movie, with the exception of Jensen. I feel he's really the only one that really gets to shine. Maybe Cougar too, since he's not that far off from his comic counterpart. Which is a shame because the characters in the comics are interesting and more fleshed out. I think the biggest fails in the movie are Clay, Rogue, and Max. In the comics, Clay, while he does have a tad bit of humanity, at least as far as his team goes, he's very unhinged and brutal. And to not get that from Jeffrey Dean Morgan, despite him playing the comedian and later on Negan, is a real disappointment, because Clay here seems like he's trying to be Captain America or Superman, only a tad bit more violent. In the comics, Roke is a lot more brutal, and unfortunately because his villainous turn doesn't come until the final act, you don't really get that. And Max in the comics is very evil and sadistic and is a legit threat to the losers, but here he's portrayed like a spoiled brat with money. And it's a shame because I always thought Jason Patric was an underrated actor, and on paper he seemed like he'd be perfect casting. Also, while the plot for this movie is definitely promising, it didn't really feel like this was a blockbuster experience. It honestly felt like something you could get at the time on Redbox, or later on streaming. Anyway, despite these flaws, I still really enjoyed the movie. Yeah, I know it's different from the comics, but still, I think the cast and crew managed to make it work. I think Chris Evans as Jensen was definitely the highlight of the movie, and the most spot on as far as how he's portrayed in the comics. I also thought Holt McCallany as Wade was awesome too. Writing and characterizations aside, I do think that the actors all did a great job. Now, unlike some of the other movies I covered here, The Losers doesn't really have a licensed soundtrack album, but they did have the song Don't Stop Believing by Journey, which is the song Jensen dances to. And The Losers unfortunately bombed, only making around $30 million. On a $25 million budget. And I think there are some reasons it bombed. First being the lack of marketing. I can't really recall anyone talking about this movie back then. And the ads really seemed like they were showing barely weeks before it hit theaters. And unfortunately the movie lacked any real star power at the time of the release. And like I said, the casts were still establishing themselves, and it would only be after this movie where some of them were finally household names. Also, some people wrote this movie off as an A-Team clone. And speaking of the A-Team, there was a movie that same year, which was another bomb unfortunately, but I still enjoyed it. We also got The Expendables, where we would finally see some of the action greats team up, which honestly sounds way better than an obscure comic. And I couldn't find any information if this was intended to be the start of a film franchise. Again, there are 5 arcs, and Max did escape at the end, but Roke seemed to die, so I don't know. They'd probably have to make up some material if there was going to be sequels. So yeah, I think The Losers was a victim of bad timing, because if this was made now, I'm sure it would be a hit series on Amazon like The Boys and Invincible. And again, I do think the movie does deserve more love, and it's currently on HBO Max if you want to stream for yourself. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about The Losers. Did you enjoy it? If so, what'd you like about it? If not, what didn't you like? Also, did you read the comics? If so, do you think the losers should be given another adaptation one day? Also, comment down below if you have any ideas for my next retrospect. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. This is Venomous Media signing off.